Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. I have spent 6 years inspecting abandoned mines all over Alaska, and during that time I have seen things that would make most people completely reconsider their career choices. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work as a mining safety inspector for the state. It is not a glamorous job, but someone has to make sure these old tunnels do not become death traps for curious explorers or local kids looking for an adventure. Most of the time, my work consists of routine inspections, checking for collapses, detecting toxic gases, and assessing structural integrity. But what happened at the old Kennecott mine completely changed everything I thought I knew about my profession. It was late October 2023 when I received an urgent call from my supervisor. Reports had come in about strange lights and sounds coming from the abandoned Kennecott copper mine, and the local authorities wanted an official inspection before the winter weather made access impossible. Kennecott is one of Alaska's most famous ghost towns, located among the Wrangell Mountains, about 5 hours northeast of Anchorage. The mine operated from 1911 to 1938, extracting millions of dollars worth of copper ore before the deposits ran out and the company left, abandoning an entire town frozen in time. I had already been to Kennecott twice before for routine inspections, always during the day and accompanied by a full team. But this time was different. The reports were happening during the night shift hours, specifically between midnight and 3 in the morning. So I would have to conduct a nighttime investigation to properly assess what people were seeing. My supervisor assigned me a partner, a young geologist named Marcus Chen, fresh out of college and eager to prove what he was capable of. Looking back, I wish I had insisted on going alone. We arrived in Kennecott shortly after 11 at night, after traveling the last 20 miles on a dirt road that did not look as though it had been maintained since the 1940s. The ghost town sits at the foot of enormous mountain peaks, and even though there was a full moon, the shadows cast by those gigantic ridges made the entire settlement look as if it had sunk into darkness. The main buildings were still standing. The enormous mill, the general store, the hospital, and the rows of workers' houses that had once sheltered hundreds of miners and their families. During the day, some tourists visit the place to take pictures and learn about Alaska's mining history. But at night, it feels as if you are crossing into another world entirely. We parked near the mill building and began unloading our equipment. The standard safety gear included gas detectors, structural assessment tools, powerful LED spotlights, and emergency communication devices. Marcus was nervous. I could tell by the way he kept checking his equipment over and over again. He had read the reports about the strange lights and sounds, and clearly his imagination was starting to get the better of him. I tried to reassure him by telling him we probably would not find anything more than some loose electrical wiring causing intermittent power fluctuations, or maybe animals that had gotten inside the buildings. The Kennecott mine is made up of several levels, with a main entrance that leads into a network of tunnels stretching deep into the mountain. The original mining operation had been incredibly sophisticated for its time, with electric lighting, ventilation systems, and even a power plant that kept everything running. When the company abandoned the place, it left most of the infrastructure intact, although decades of Alaskan winters had badly deteriorated the equipment. We entered through the main tunnel exactly at midnight, our headlamps cutting through the absolute darkness that filled the galleries. The temperature inside remained constant at about 38 degrees, cold enough to see our breath, but not cold enough to freeze. Our footsteps echoed against the rock walls as we moved deeper into the mine, following the main corridor toward the areas where the lights had been reported. About 300 yards inside the tunnel system, we reached the first checkpoint. That was the place where the original miners gathered for shift changes, a large circular chamber with several tunnel entrances branching off in different directions. I was preparing my gas detection equipment when Marcus grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of our own breathing. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. At first, there was nothing but the typical sounds you would expect in an abandoned mine. Water dripping somewhere in the distance, the occasional creaking of old wooden supports settling, and the hiss of air moving through the ventilation shafts. But then I heard it too. It was a rhythmic tapping, a metallic sound against metal coming from somewhere deeper inside the mine. Probably just thermal expansion, I told Marcus, although I was not completely convinced myself. Metal contracts and expands with temperature changes. These old support beams have been doing that for decades. But that sound was too regular, too intentional to be random thermal movement. It had a pattern, as if someone were striking something with a hammer or operating machinery. We decided to investigate it and followed the sound into deeper areas of the mining complex. The tapping led us through a side tunnel I had never explored during my previous inspections. That passage was narrower than the main corridors, with roughly carved walls that showed marks from hand tools rather than modern excavation equipment. The original miners must have opened that section by hand, probably following an especially rich copper vein. Our headlamps revealed support beams that looked ancient and potentially unstable, but my structural readings indicated that they were still holding firm. As we moved farther into the tunnel, the metallic sound became louder and more defined. It was clearly metallic, and it was definitely rhythmic. But now there was something else beneath that noise. Voices. Human voices speaking in low tones that I could not make out clearly. Marcus heard them too, because he stopped walking and turned toward me with his eyes wide open. "There's someone else down here," he said, pointing out the obvious. My first thought was that we had stumbled upon intruders, maybe urban explorers or treasure hunters trying to steal artifacts. It would not have been the first time someone had broken into an abandoned mine. But as we got closer to the source of the sounds, I realized that something did not fit. The voices were not speaking English or any language I could recognize. They had a strangely hollow quality, as if they were coming from very far away or passing through some kind of audio distortion. We turned a curve in the tunnel and found ourselves in front of the entrance to a large underground chamber. It was clearly one of the original extraction areas, with elevated rails still installed for ore carts and signs of extensive excavation work. But what froze us in place was what we saw inside the chamber. There were lights, not electric lights, but the warm, trembling glow of oil lamps and lanterns, and silhouettes, human figures moving through the chamber, carrying tools and equipment, working in what appeared to be an active mining operation. The metallic sound came from their picks and shovels as they struck the rock wall, and the voices belonged to the miners giving instructions to one another. I stood there for what felt like several minutes trying to process what I was seeing. My rational mind insisted that it had to be some kind of elaborate trick, or perhaps a historical reenactment no one had told us about. But something about the scene felt deeply wrong. The lighting was too dim and irregular, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the sources that created them. The figures themselves looked translucent, as if they were made of smoke or mist instead of solid matter. Marcus was gripping my arm so tightly that I could feel his fingers through my thick jacket. He was trembling, although I could not tell whether it was from the cold or from fear. I reached for my radio to contact our supervisor, but when I tried to activate the microphone, all I got was static. We were too deep underground for normal radio communication, but my equipment should have been able to connect to the repeater we had installed outside. Something was interfering with the signal. One of the figures inside the chamber turned toward us, and for the first time I could see his face clearly. It was the face of a man in his 40s with a thick mustache and sunken eyes that seemed to shine with an inner light of their own. He wore the kind of work clothes miners would have worn in the 1920s. Heavy canvas pants, a wool shirt, and a leather cap with a carbide lamp attached to the front. But the most disturbing thing about that man was that I could see through him. He was there, but at the same time he was not, like a double-exposed photograph on the same strip of film. The miner looked directly at me and smiled, raising his hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. Then he turned back toward his work and drove the pick into the rock wall with mechanical precision. The other figures continued with their activities as if we were not there at all, loading ore into the carts, reinforcing the tunnel supports, and shouting instructions to one another in that strange resonant language. I do not know how long we remained there watching that impossible scene. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to move differently inside that chamber, as if we had stepped out of the normal flow of reality. Finally, Marcus tugged on my sleeve and pointed toward the tunnel entrance. His intention was clear. We had to leave, and we had to do it immediately. We backed away from the chamber as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb whatever we had just witnessed. Once we rounded the curve and were out of sight of that mining operation, we moved as quickly as we could through the tunnels toward the surface. Neither of us spoke during the retreat. We were both too shaken by what we had seen to put it into words. When we finally came out through the mine entrance, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear over the mountain peaks. We had been underground for more than 6 hours, although it had felt like much less time. We packed our equipment in silence and drove back toward Anchorage without talking about what had happened. It was not until we were back in the office the next day that Marcus finally asked me what I thought we had seen. I told him the truth. I had no idea. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under examination. There had not been any active mining operation at Kennecott since 1938. There was no historical reenactment group scheduled to use the site. The figures we saw were translucent, and they spoke in a language that did not match any of the ethnic groups that worked in the mine during its years of operation. I filed my official report as a routine inspection with no significant findings. I could not bring myself to document what we had actually witnessed, because I knew no one would believe it. But I have not been able to stop thinking about that night, and I have extensively researched the history of the Kennecott mine. What I discovered unsettles me even more than the ghostly miners themselves. According to historical records, several fatal accidents occurred during the mine's years of operation. Collapses, gas explosions, and machinery failures claimed the lives of at least 37 workers between 1911 and 1938. Many of those men were buried in unmarked graves near the mining site because their families could not afford to transport the bodies back to their home states. I believe we witnessed the midnight shift that never ended. Miners who died in those tunnels and who continue working in death just as they did in life. They are trapped in that underground world, forever extracting copper ore that no longer exists, from rock walls that were exhausted decades ago. I have not returned to Kennecott since that night, and I have asked my supervisor to assign that site to other inspectors. Marcus was transferred to another department within the following 6 months, and now works exclusively on surface-level projects. We have never spoken about that night again. But sometimes I catch him looking at me from across the office with the same tormented expression I see in my own reflection. The reports of lights and sounds in Kennecott continue to come in, always during the midnight hours, always from people who claim to have seen things that should not exist. Now I know they are telling the truth, and I know that somewhere deep inside those mountain tunnels, the midnight shift continues its eternal work. Story 2. Searching for antiques in ghost towns is not just my hobby. It is what pays my bills. And in a way that few people can understand, it also feeds my soul. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and for the past 8 years I have traveled across Alaska, exploring abandoned buildings in search of forgotten treasures that tell the stories of those who lived and died in this unforgiving land. Most people think I am crazy for spending entire weeks in such desolate places, but there is something almost magical about finding a fragment of history that no one else thought was worth saving. I have a small antique shop in Anchorage called Forgotten Alaska. My customers range from serious collectors to tourists looking for authentic frontier souvenirs. The real money is in rare finds, original mining equipment, Alaska Native artifacts sold with proper documentation, and vintage clothing from the gold rush era. Women's clothing from the early 20th century is especially valuable because very few pieces managed to survive the harsh conditions and practical demands of life on the frontier. That is why I was so excited when I heard about the intact buildings of Daya, a ghost town near Skagway that most people have never even heard of. Daya was a boomtown during the Klondike Gold Rush in the 1890s, and it served as a starting point for prospectors heading toward the Chilkoot Pass. At its peak, the town had more than 8,000 residents, dozens of businesses, and all the features of a thriving frontier community. But when the railroad reached Skagway in 1900, Daya was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind an entire town frozen in time. I received a tip from another dealer who told me about a general store in Daya that, according to him, still contained original merchandise from the 1890s. The building had been locked when the last owner left, and the severe weather had kept most treasure hunters away. Getting there required a combination of driving and hiking that would take a good part of the day, but the potential payoff made the effort worthwhile. I left on a clear morning in September 2023, driving north along the Alaska Highway toward the Canadian border before turning west toward Skagway. The final stretch to Daya required leaving the main road and following an old mining trail that tested the limits of my four-wheel drive truck. The ghost town sits in a valley surrounded by immense peaks, accessible only during the brief summer and autumn months when the passes are clear of snow. Today, Daya consists of scattered foundations, a few partially standing structures, and the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling dock that extended into the Lynn Canal. Most of the original buildings had collapsed decades earlier, but I could see the general store my contact had described, still standing in what would have been the center of town. It was a two-story wooden structure with weather-worn siding and a sloped roof that had somehow survived more than a century of Alaskan winters. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that had rusted until it was completely useless, but I found a loose board in the back wall that allowed me to slip inside. As soon as I crossed through that opening, I knew I had found something special. The building still smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and specks of dust danced in the beams of sunlight entering through the cracked windows. The main floor had been the sales area, with wooden shelves lining the walls and a long counter stretching across the center of the room. Most of the merchandise had been removed when the store closed, but I could still see remnants of the original inventory: rusted tools, empty bottles, and rolls of fabric that had survived because they were stored in sealed containers. But it was the second floor that took my breath away. That had been the living space for the owners, and it looked as if the family had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. There was furniture from the 1890s, personal photographs, books, and clothing still hanging inside a wooden wardrobe. It was exactly the kind of untouched find antique dealers dream about. I spent the first few hours carefully cataloging everything I could see, taking photographs and making notes about the most valuable pieces. There was a dining room set that could easily sell for $5,000, several oil paintings that appeared to be original works, and what looked like a complete porcelain set from a prestigious Eastern manufacturer. But it was while examining the porcelain that I noticed something else. A white garment hung in the back corner of the wardrobe, partially hidden behind other clothes. When I carefully moved the other pieces aside, I found myself looking at the most beautiful wedding dress I had ever seen in my life. It was made of ivory silk, with intricate beadwork and lace details that must have required hundreds of hours of hand sewing. The style was typical of the 1890s: a fitted bodice, a full skirt, and a train that would have stretched several feet behind the bride. But what made that dress truly extraordinary was its state of preservation. Despite being more than 120 years old, it looked as though it had been made the day before. The silk had not yellowed or deteriorated. The beadwork was intact, and there was not a single stain or tear anywhere on the garment. I had handled enough antique clothing to know that this level of preservation was practically impossible. Silk from that era should have become brittle and discolored after more than a century, especially with the extreme changes in Alaska's climate. And yet that dress looked ready to be worn at a wedding the very next day. As I removed it from the wardrobe to examine it more closely, I noticed another strange detail. Despite the size of the garment, it seemed to weigh almost nothing, as if it were made of air instead of fabric. And when I held it up in front of the window to look at the beadwork, I would have sworn the dress moved slightly, as if a soft breeze had passed through the room, even though all the windows were closed and there was no air circulation. I decided to take the dress back to Anchorage for a proper appraisal and possible sale. A Klondike-era wedding dress in that condition could be worth at least $20,000 to the right collector. I carefully wrapped it in acid-free tissue paper and placed it inside a special garment box designed for transporting antique clothing. The trip back to Anchorage was uneventful, but I could not stop thinking about the dress the entire way. There was something about that find that felt different from my other discoveries. Normally, when I find a valuable antique, I feel satisfaction and excitement over the potential profit. With this dress, I felt something else. A strange sense of responsibility, as if I had been entrusted with something precious instead of simply acquiring merchandise for my shop. I got home late that night and carefully moved the dress box into my workshop, where I had the proper equipment to examine and restore antique textiles. I planned to spend the next few days researching the dress's origin and preparing it for sale. But first, I wanted to take some detailed photographs for my records. When I opened the box and removed the tissue paper, the dress looked exactly as it had in Daya. In perfect condition, with flawless white silk and delicate beadwork that captured the light from my photography lamps. I set up my camera equipment and began taking detailed images of the bodice, the sleeves, and the skirt. It was while photographing the train of the dress that I saw her for the first time. In my camera's viewfinder, standing behind the dress, was a young woman in her 20s, with dark hair arranged in the elaborate style typical of the 1890s. She was beautiful, with delicate features and large eyes that seemed to look directly at me through the camera lens. But when I lowered the camera to look at the dress directly, no one was there. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light or a reflection from one of my photography lamps. But when I raised the camera again, she was still there. This time she seemed to be reaching one hand toward the dress, as if trying to touch it. I set the camera down on a table and stepped back, my heart racing. I have been surrounded by antiques for my entire adult life, and I have heard all kinds of stories about objects that preserve the energy or memories of their former owners. I had always dismissed those stories as superstitions, but I could not explain what I was seeing through my camera. Over the next few days, the incidents intensified. Every time I tried to work with the dress, whether to examine it in greater detail or to take additional photographs, I saw the young woman. Sometimes she appeared as a reflection in mirrors or windows. Other times I caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, standing in the corner of my workshop or passing in front of the door. But it was not just visual appearances. The dress itself began behaving strangely. I would arrange it a certain way to photograph it, and when I returned the next morning, I would find it positioned differently, as if someone had been handling it during the night. The silk, which should have been cold to the touch, sometimes felt warm when I touched it, as if someone had just been wearing it. I tried to research the history of the Daya General Store and its owners, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. What I discovered made the situation even more unsettling. The store had belonged to a family with the last name Patterson, who arrived in Daya in 1897, at the height of the gold rush. Thomas Patterson ran the business while his wife, Margaret, took care of their daughter Sarah, who was 19 years old when they came to Alaska. According to the records I found, Sarah Patterson was engaged to marry a gold prospector named William Hayes in the spring of 1899, but the wedding never took place. William Hayes died in an avalanche while trying to cross the Chilkoot Pass in March 1899, barely 2 months before the planned ceremony. Sarah Patterson died of pneumonia that same winter, and her parents abandoned Daya the following summer, unable to bear the memories associated with the town. The dress I had found was Sarah Patterson's wedding dress, never worn, never removed from the wardrobe. It had waited there for more than 120 years. The more I learned about Sarah's story, the more intense the paranormal activity in my workshop became. In the morning, I would find old photographs scattered around the dress, as if someone had been looking through them during the night. My equipment would appear moved or turned off, and sometimes I heard what sounded like soft crying coming from the corner where I kept the dress. The final incident occurred 3 weeks after I had brought the dress from Daya to my home. I had been working late at the shop, trying to complete the documentation necessary to sell the dress to a collector in Seattle. It was almost midnight when I heard music coming from my workshop. A soft, delicate melody that sounded like a music box or a player piano. When I went to investigate, I found the dress floating 3 feet above the floor, swaying gently as if someone were wearing it and dancing to the rhythm of that distant music. The young woman I had seen in my photographs was now fully visible. Translucent, yes, but clearly present. She was wearing the dress and moving in a waltz pattern around my workshop. She saw me watching her and stopped dancing. She turned toward me with an expression of infinite sadness. When she spoke, her voice sounded as if it came from a very far-away place. "I never got to wear it," she said. "I never got to dance at my wedding." I stood there frozen, unable to move or say a single word, while Sarah Patterson continued dancing in her wedding dress to the rhythm of music only she could hear. After what felt like hours, although it was probably only minutes, she began to slowly fade away, and the dress gently descended until it rested on my work table. The next morning, I carefully packed the wedding dress inside its garment box and drove back to Daya. I returned it to the wardrobe where I had found it, arranging it exactly as it had been when I first discovered it. As I left the abandoned store, I would have sworn I heard a woman's voice saying, "Thank you." The word came carried on the wind. I never entered that building again, and I have never told anyone what I experienced with Sarah Patterson's wedding dress. Some objects are not meant to be bought or sold. Some treasures must remain where they are, keeping their secrets and their sorrow in the places where they belong. The dress is still there in Daya, waiting inside the wardrobe of an abandoned general store, as beautiful and perfect as the day it was made. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind blows in the right direction, locals say waltz music can be heard floating among the ruins of the old town, as if someone were finally having the wedding dance that never happened. Story 3. When I was a child, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old railroad days. He spoke about that era when the Alaska Railroad was the lifeline connecting remote communities to the rest of the world. He worked as a conductor for 37 years, traveling those rails through some of the most beautiful and dangerous landscapes on Earth. My name is Marcus Washington, and I am 24 years old. Unlike my grandfather, I never worked professionally for the railroad, but trains have been my great passion since childhood. I collect old railroad-related objects, study historic routes, and spend my weekends exploring abandoned rail lines all over Alaska. That passion was exactly what led me to McCarthy in October 2023. McCarthy is a tiny community located at the end of one of the most remote railroad branches ever built in Alaska. The Copper River and Northwestern Railway built the line in the early 1910s to transport copper ore from the Kennecott mines to the port of Cordova. When the mines closed in 1938, the railroad was abandoned, leaving behind nearly 200 miles of tracks, bridges, and tunnel infrastructure that slowly began disappearing back beneath the advance of nature. Most of the original rail line has been reclaimed by the forest or dismantled and sold as scrap, but some sections near McCarthy still preserve evidence of that engineering marvel that once transported millions of tons of ore across mountainous terrain that seemed impossible to cross. I had been planning that trip for months. I wanted to photograph the trestles that still remained standing and document what survived of the old route before winter made access impossible. I arrived in McCarthy on a gray Thursday afternoon, driving along the famous and difficult McCarthy Road, which follows more or less the same route the railroad once traveled. The road is 60 miles of potholes, washed-out sections, and one-lane bridges that test both the vehicle and the driver's nerves. McCarthy itself has perhaps 25 year-round residents, most of whom make their living from the handful of tourists who visit the area during the summer months. I had booked a room at a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Rose Delano, whose family had lived in the region since the railroad days. Rose was in her 70s, with silver hair and the weathered hands you only get after decades of living in Alaska. She seemed pleased to have a guest interested in local railroad history. During dinner that first night, she shared stories with me from the old days, when the train arrived twice a week loaded with supplies, mail, and passengers. My father worked for the railroad, she told me as we sat in her kitchen drinking coffee. He was a section foreman, and he was responsible for maintaining about 10 miles of track through some of the hardest terrain you can imagine. She said that railroad was built more on determination than on engineering sense. Rose warned me about exploring the old rail line alone, especially during the short days of October, when darkness came early and the weather could change without warning. But she also understood the fascination with railroad history. so she agreed to lend me an old trail map where the most accessible remaining sections of track were marked. The next morning, I set out with my camera equipment, hiking boots, and enough supplies for a full day of exploration. The section I planned to document was about 3 miles from town, at a point where the railroad had crossed a deep gorge over a wooden trestle bridge. According to my research, parts of that bridge were still standing, although the rails had been removed decades earlier. The hike to the bridge site took me through dense forest and uneven terrain that showed no sign of recent human passage. The old railroad grade was still visible in places, marked by the characteristic leveling and drainage ditches that the railroad crews had carved into the wilderness more than a century earlier. As I walked, I tried to imagine what it must have been like for those early workers, to build a railroad through a land that seemed determined to reject any human intervention. I reached the gorge around noon and found the remains of the trestle bridge exactly where my map indicated. Even in its deteriorated state, it was an impressive sight. The original structure had been built from enormous wooden beams, some nearly 3 feet thick, arranged in the complex geometric patterns typical of early 20th century railroad engineering. About half of the bridge was still standing, although it was obvious that it was not safe to cross. The missing sections had fallen to the bottom of the gorge, where I could see the twisted remains of wooden beams and iron pieces scattered among the rocks. I spent several hours photographing the bridge from different angles, documenting the construction techniques and hardware that would have been cutting-edge technology when the line was built. The afternoon was quiet, except for the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant call of ravens. It was exactly the kind of peaceful and isolated experience I had been looking for. When the sun began sinking toward the western mountains, I started packing up my equipment to begin the hike back to town. October days were short, and I wanted to be off the trail before complete darkness fell. That was when I heard it for the first time, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the forest. At first I thought it might be a helicopter or a small plane, but the sound did not fit that. It was more mechanical, more regular, like the steady chuffing of a steam locomotive struggling to pull a heavy load uphill on a steep grade. I stopped packing and listened more carefully, trying to determine where the noise was coming from. The sound grew louder and more defined, and I realized with a chill that it was coming from the direction of the abandoned rail line. Not just from that general area, but specifically from the tracks themselves, as if a train were approaching the bridge where I stood. I told myself it had to be some kind of industrial machinery, maybe a maintenance crew working on the road system, or some mining operation I had not heard about. But as the sound continued to grow, I began to distinguish other noises beneath the main sound of the engine. The rhythmic clatter of wheels over rails, the squeal of metal brake shoes, and what sounded like the sharp whistle of a steam locomotive echoing off the mountain walls. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was impossible. There had been no active railroad traffic in that area since 1938. The rails had been removed, the bridges were unsafe, and there was no conceivable reason for any kind of train to be operating on that abandoned line. But my ears were telling me a different story. I grabbed my camera and positioned myself where I would have a clear view of the approach to the bridge, thinking that whatever was producing that sound would have to appear before my eyes within the next few minutes. The mechanical noises were now loud enough to distinguish individual components: the heavy breathing of a steam locomotive, the rattling of several cars behind the engine, and voices shouting what sounded like work orders. That was when I saw the headlight. A single bright beam of light cut through the darkness of the forest, moving exactly along the route where the tracks had once been. Behind the light, I could make out the dark mass of a steam locomotive, with its smokestack visible against the evening sky. The engine was pulling what appeared to be a long train of freight cars, all filled with something that looked like copper ore from the Kennecott mines. I raised the camera and began taking photographs, although my hands were shaking so badly that I was not sure any of them would come out in focus. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that should not have been possible. The locomotive was a narrow-gauge machine typical of the early 1900s, painted in the dark green livery of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. I could see figures inside the cab, men dressed in the kind of work clothes railroad crews would have worn during the original operating years of the line. The train was approaching the broken bridge at what seemed to be normal operating speed, showing no sign of slowing down or stopping. I wanted to shout a warning, to do something to alert the crew that the bridge was unsafe. But no sound came out of my throat. I could only stand there watching as the locomotive reached the edge of the intact part of the trestle. What happened next defied every law of physics I knew. Instead of plunging into the gorge where the bridge was broken, the train continued forward over empty air, following the path where the missing rails should have been. I saw it with absolute clarity. A complete locomotive and a line of freight cars loaded with ore crossing a gap of more than 100 feet, supported by nothing but the thin mountain air. The ghost train completed its impossible crossing and disappeared into the forest on the other side of the gorge. The sound of its engine slowly faded into the distance. Within minutes, the mechanical noises had vanished completely, leaving only the natural sounds of the wind and wildlife that had been there before. I remained for a long time at the edge of the broken bridge, staring across to the other side of the gorge and trying to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally checked the camera to see the photographs I had taken, every single image showed only the empty forest and the shattered remains of the trestle bridge. Whatever I had seen and heard had left no trace at all on the digital sensor. The hike back to McCarthy as darkness fell was the longest of my life. Every sound in the forest made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the headlight of the ghost train approaching from behind. By the time I reached Rose's bed and breakfast, my nerves were completely shattered. Rose took one look at me and immediately made a pot of strong coffee. She had me sit at her kitchen table while I tried to explain what had happened. She listened to my story without interrupting me, nodding from time to time but showing no signs of surprise or disbelief. When I finished, Rose remained silent for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I could not fully interpret. "You are not the first person to see that train," she said quietly. "My father saw it 3 times during his years working the section. Always at dusk, always crossing that same bridge." She said they were the spirits of the crewmen who died in the derailment, still trying to complete their journey to Cordova. Rose walked over to an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1923. The headline read, "Train derailment claims 6 lives near McCarthy." According to the article, a locomotive and 4 ore cars had plunged from the trestle bridge during a winter storm, killing the entire crew. Their bodies were never recovered from the bottom of the gorge. "Every few years someone sees them," Rose continued. "Always the same train, always crossing the broken bridge, always headed to Cordova with a load of copper ore. My father used to say they will keep making that run until someone repairs the bridge and allows them to complete their journey." I left McCarthy the next morning, cutting short the week-long visit I had planned. I have not been back since, and I have no intention of returning. Sometimes late at night, when I hear the distant whistle of a modern freight train, I think of those ghostly railroad men, trapped forever on their endless run through the Alaskan wilderness. The photographs I took that day show nothing out of the ordinary, only the broken remains of an old trestle bridge in a remote mountain gorge. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Somewhere in the forests around McCarthy, the last train is still running, carrying its spectral crew and its ghostly cargo on a journey that will never end. Story 4. As a substitute teacher, I have worked in some pretty remote places all over Alaska, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the abandoned school in Chatina. My name is Emma Thompson, and I am 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I have traveled between small communities throughout the state, covering classes wherever certified teachers are needed. It is demanding work, but also very rewarding, especially when you can see children from isolated areas receive the education they deserve. Most of the communities I visit are still active, with functioning schools and students eager to learn. But every now and then I come across places where the schools have been abandoned for decades, victims of economic decline or population changes that left entire towns empty. Chatina falls into that category. It was once a thriving railroad town with more than 1,000 residents. Today it has fewer than 50 year-round residents, most of them older people or people who work in tourism-related businesses during the brief summer season. I arrived in Chitina in late September 2023, not to teach, but to research a paper I was writing about rural education in Alaska for my master's program. The Old Town School, built in 1915, was supposed to be an excellent example of early 20th century frontier architecture, adapted for educational purposes. I had received permission from the town council to photograph and document the building, with a commitment to share my research with the local historical society. The school sits on a small hill overlooking what remains of Chitina's Main Street. It is a 2-story wooden structure, with tall windows designed to make the most of natural light during Alaska's dark winter months. The building served the community from 1915 until 1987, when declining enrollment forced classes to be consolidated with a school in nearby Glenallen. Since then, it had remained closed and practically forgotten, slowly deteriorating under the relentless weather. I arrived in Chitina on a gray afternoon that threatened rain. After driving the 70 miles of gravel road from the Richardson Highway, the town felt almost deserted, with most of its buildings showing signs of abandonment or minimal maintenance. The few residents I crossed paths with were friendly, although they seemed surprised that anyone was interested in the old school. The building's caretaker was a man named Robert Steinberg, who had been a student there in the 1960s and later served on the school board when the institution closed. He was in his 70s with thick gray hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Robert seemed genuinely pleased that someone wanted to document the school's history. He spent almost an hour telling me stories about teachers and students from decades past. "That place holds a lot of memories," he told me as he handed me the keys to the front door. "Some good, some not so good. The winters were hard on everyone, especially the children who had to walk miles to get to class. Over the years, we lost some students to accidents and illness, but the school kept running until there simply weren't enough children left to justify keeping it open." Robert warned me that the building's electrical system had been disconnected years earlier, so I would need to bring my own lighting equipment. He also mentioned that some floorboards on the second level could be dangerous, and he advised me to stay on the main floor if possible. With those warnings in mind, I thanked him for his time and climbed the hill to begin my documentation work. The school's front door opened with a loud creak that echoed throughout the empty building. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the stale smell of old wood and paper that had not been touched in decades. The main floor consisted of 2 large classrooms, a small office that had served as the principal's office, and a narrow hallway connecting to the staircase leading to the second floor. Both classrooms still held much of their original equipment: wooden desks arranged in rows, a large chalkboard at the front of each room, and educational posters that had faded over the years, though they were still partially legible. In one of the classrooms, I found a globe that must have dated back to the 1950s, with countries and borders that no longer existed. In the other room, there was a piano in one corner, its keys yellowed with age and several strings broken. I spent the first few hours taking photographs and making detailed notes about the architectural features and educational materials. The building was an extraordinary time capsule, preserving not only the physical structure, but also the atmosphere of a frontier school where children had learned to read and write in one of the harshest environments in America. As the afternoon went on, I decided to explore the second floor. Despite Robert's warnings about the floorboards, I tested each step carefully as I climbed the narrow staircase and discovered that, although some of the wood was soft with age, the structure seemed mostly sound. The second floor had originally been designed as an auditorium and gathering space, with a small stage at one end and rows of wooden benches facing it. It was while I was photographing the stage area that I heard the school bell for the first time. The sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze tone of a large school bell ringing with the measured rhythm that would have called students to class or dismissed them for recess. But according to Robert, the bell had been removed from the building years earlier and donated to a museum in Anchorage. I looked around for some obvious source of the sound, but the bell tower visible from outside was clearly empty. I told myself it had to be some acoustic phenomenon. perhaps the wind blowing through the empty bell tower in a way that produced that noise. But while I continued working, the bell rang again, this time with a different pattern. 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones. It was the traditional signal for the end of the school day, a pattern that must have been used thousands of times during the building's 72 years of operation. The third time I heard the bell, it was accompanied by other sounds. The scraping of chairs against wooden floors, the rustle of papers being gathered, and what sounded like children's voices speaking excitedly as they prepared to leave at the end of the day. The sounds were coming from the classrooms on the main floor directly below me. I went down the stairs as quietly as possible, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening below. When I reached the hallway, I could hear the sounds more clearly. There were definitely children talking. Their voices were high and animated, the way kids sound when they are excited about something. Every now and then I could make out individual words: homework, recess, and Miss Anderson. I approached the first classroom and looked in from the doorway. What I saw made no rational sense, but I could not deny what my own eyes were witnessing. The classroom was full of children, perhaps 20 or 25 students between the ages of 6 and 14. They were dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to the 1940s or 1950s. Simple dresses for the girls, knickerbockers and suspenders for the boys, and practical shoes suitable for walking long distances over difficult terrain. At the front of the classroom stood a woman in her 30s, wearing a long skirt and a white blouse typical of mid-20th century fashion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that matched the era of the children's clothing. She was writing something on the chalkboard, and I could see that her handwriting was the kind of careful penmanship teachers from that period insisted on teaching their students. The children looked solid and real, not translucent or ghostly in any obvious way. They gathered their books and papers, put on coats and hats, and talked among themselves about typical school-age concerns. But there was something subtly wrong with the scene, something I could not identify at first. It took me several minutes of watching to understand what was unsettling me. The children cast no shadows. Despite the strong afternoon light entering through the tall windows, none of the figures inside the classroom produced the dark silhouettes living people would have created. They were there, but not completely. They existed in some state between reality and memory. The teacher at the front of the room looked up from the chalkboard and made eye contact with me. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile, the kind that suggested she truly cared for her students. When she spoke, her voice had that firm, projected clarity that good teachers develop after years of addressing classrooms full of children. "Classes are over for today," she said, though she continued looking directly at me instead of at her students. "Please remember to finish your arithmetic problems for tomorrow and dress warmly for the walk home. Winter will come early this year." The children began leaving the classroom in an orderly line, passing within inches of where I stood in the hallway. As they walked beside me, I could feel a slight drop in the temperature of the air, as if each child were surrounded by a small pocket of cold that moved with them. Some of the smaller ones looked at me with curious expressions, but none of them seemed surprised or frightened by my presence. One girl, perhaps 8 years old, with blonde braids and a red wool coat, stopped directly in front of me and tugged on the sleeve of my jacket. When I looked down at her, she smiled and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Are you our new teacher?" she asked. "Miss Anderson has been waiting for someone to help her with the upper grades. There are so many of us now, and we all want to learn." Before I could answer, the girl kept walking toward the front door, joining the group of students leaving the building. I followed them outside and watched as they dispersed in different directions down the hill, toward what had once been Kaitina's residential neighborhoods. Some walked alone, others in small groups, all with the determined stride of children returning home after a normal school day. The teacher, Miss Anderson, was the last to leave the building. She stopped beside me on the front steps and looked toward the nearly empty town spread out below. "We have waited so long for the school to reopen," she said softly. "The children miss their lessons terribly. They keep coming back, hoping that someday there will be teachers, books, and proper classes again." She turned to look directly at me, and I could see that her eyes held deep sadness mixed with hope. "Will you stay and teach them?" she asked. It has been so many years without proper instruction. They deserve to finish their education, to learn everything they should have learned before. She paused, and the sadness in her eyes became even deeper. Before the accident, I wanted to ask her what accident she meant, what had happened to those children and to her. But before I could form the words, she smiled once more and walked down the hill in the same direction her students had taken. I watched her until she disappeared around a corner, leaving me alone in front of the abandoned school. When I returned the keys to Robert Steinberg that night, I asked him about Miss Anderson and whether any accident connected to the school had happened during its years of operation. His expression became somber, and he invited me into his house for coffee and a conversation I would never forget. Margaret Anderson taught here from 1952 until 1967, he told me, settling into an old recliner beside his wood stove. She was one of the best teachers we ever had. She truly cared about the children and did everything she could to help families who were struggling. She never married. She said the children were her family. Robert paused to take a sip of coffee, and I could see that he was deciding how much to tell me. The accident happened in February of 1967, he continued. There was a terrible blizzard, the worst storm anyone could remember. School should have been canceled, but the weather report was wrong and it caught everyone by surprise. Miss Anderson kept all the children inside until the storm passed, but the building's heating system failed during the night. He fell silent for a long moment, staring into his cup. They found them the next morning when the storm cleared, all together in the main classroom, where Miss Anderson had gathered them around the piano to keep their spirits up. Carbon monoxide from a faulty chimney, 23 children and their teacher, all dead. I spent one more night in Chaitina, but I did not return to the school. The next morning, as I loaded my car to drive back to Anchorage, I heard the school bell ringing through the empty town. 3 short rings, 2 long ones, calling the students to another day of learning that would never end. Story 5. My job takes me to some of the most isolated communities in Alaska, places where receiving supplies can make the difference between life and death during the long winter months. My name is Ryan Alley, and I am 35 years old. For the past 8 years, I have worked as a supply chain manager for Northern Logistics, a company specializing in delivering goods to remote villages, mining operations, and research stations throughout the state. It is a demanding job, one that requires careful planning and a very clear understanding of how quickly the weather can turn a routine delivery into a survival situation. Most of my routes involve active communities, with real people who depend on our deliveries for everything from food and medicine to fuel and equipment parts. But every now and then, I receive requests to bring goods to places that exist more in documents than in reality. Sites where someone still maintains a mailing address, even though the community itself has been abandoned for decades. That was the case with Elamar, a ghost town in Prince William Sound that had been a copper mining community between 1897 and 1919. According to my delivery manifest, someone in Elamar had ordered a considerable shipment of basic supplies, canned food, batteries, medical materials, and other items that would be essential for surviving an Alaskan winter. The order had been paid in advance with a cashier's check that processed without any problem. But when I tried to contact the customer by phone to coordinate the delivery details, the number was disconnected. Company policy required me to attempt the delivery even when it was not possible to contact the customer. So I loaded my supply truck and headed toward the coordinates listed on the shipping manifest. The trip to Elamar required taking the Seward Highway south from Anchorage, then following a series of increasingly remote roads toward the coast. The final stretch was a narrow gravel track that had not been maintained in years, winding through dense forest before emerging along the shore of Prince William Sound. Elamar sits beside a natural harbor that, in its time, had been ideal for shipping copper ore to markets in the lower 48 states. During its most active years, the town housed nearly 800 residents, with all the infrastructure necessary for a thriving mining community. Homes, businesses, a school, and most important for my purposes, a company store that functioned as the commercial center of the settlement. When I arrived in late October 2023, Elamar consisted of scattered foundations, a few partially standing structures, and the skeletal remains of mining machinery that had been too expensive to remove when the copper ran out. Most of the original buildings had collapsed or been dismantled for their materials, but I could make out one structure that seemed to be in relatively good condition. It was a 2-story wooden building with weather-damaged siding and a hand-painted sign that read, Elamar Company Store. According to the shipping address on my manifest, that was where I had to deliver the supplies I was carrying. The building looked abandoned like everything else in the ghost town, but my instructions were clear, and I had learned not to question the eccentricities of Alaskan residents who choose to live in remote places. I parked my truck in front of the store and began unloading boxes of supplies onto a hand truck. The front door of the building was closed, but it was not locked. It opened with a loud creak when I pushed it. Inside, I found what looked like a perfectly preserved general store from the early 20th century, complete with wooden shelves, glass-fronted display cases, and a long counter with an old cash register. The store still contained merchandise, although everything was covered with decades of dust and showed signs of aging and abandonment. There were rolls of fabric, hand tools, canned foods with labels I did not recognize, and various household items that would have been essential for life on the frontier. The atmosphere was heavy with the smell of old wood and paper, and dust motes danced in the rays of afternoon sunlight entering through the dirty windows. I began stacking the supply boxes near the main counter, intending to leave them there along with the delivery notes since there did not seem to be anyone present to sign for the shipment. That was when I heard footsteps coming from the back of the store, followed by a voice calling out in a friendly tone, "One moment, I'll be right with you." A man stepped out of what appeared to be a storage area behind the main counter. He was about 50 years old, with graying hair and a thick mustache, typical of men from the early 20th century. He wore a white shirt with sleeve garters, dark trousers held up by suspenders, and a leather apron that suggested he was the store owner. What struck me most about his appearance was how clean and well-dressed he was, as if he had just begun his workday instead of having spent decades inside an abandoned building. "You must be from Northern Logistics," he said with a warm smile. "I have been waiting quite some time for this delivery. I hope you had no trouble finding us." I was confused by his comment about having been waiting for the delivery for so long, since the order had been placed only 2 weeks earlier, but I assumed he was referring to the difficulties of getting supplies to such a remote location. I handed him the delivery manifest and waited while he reviewed the list of items I had brought. "This is perfect," he said, nodding with satisfaction. "My customers have been asking for these products, and I was beginning to worry that I would not be able to fill their orders before winter arrives." I looked around the empty store and wondered what customers he was talking about. But it was not my job to question the way people chose to run their businesses. I helped him carry the supply boxes behind the counter, and he placed them carefully on the shelves and in the storage areas with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been running a general store for many years. When we finished moving the supplies, the shopkeeper reached into a wooden cash drawer and counted out the delivery payment and bills. The bills were crisp and new, despite having a design that had not been used in decades. I had seen enough old currency during my years in Alaska to recognize that they were authentic bills from the 1940s and 1950s, although they looked freshly printed. "I appreciate you making the trip all the way out here," he said as he handed me the money. "I know it is not easy to reach Elamar, especially this late in the season. My customers will be very pleased to see that I have stocked the shelves again." As if his words had summoned them, I heard the front door of the store open, followed by the sound of several people entering the building. I turned and saw a group of men and women dressed in work clothes from the early 20th century, carrying shopping baskets and talking among themselves about the items they needed to purchase. They looked like miners and their families, the kind of people who would have made up Elamar's population during its active years. The customers moved through the store with familiarity, selecting items from the shelves and discussing prices with the shopkeeper. They looked solid and real, not translucent or obviously supernatural. But there was something about their presence that made the air inside the store feel dense, charged with energy. As they shopped, they occasionally gave me polite, curious glances, but no one seemed surprised or concerned by my presence. A woman approached the counter with a selection of canned food and fabric. She was about 30 years old, wearing a simple dress and a shawl that suggested she was the wife of one of the miners. When she spoke to the shopkeeper, her voice had a strange resonant quality, as if it came from very far away. "Put this on the Murphy account," she said. "John will pay on payday as always." The shopkeeper nodded and made notes in a leather-bound ledger, recording the transaction in careful handwriting. As he worked, more customers continued entering the store, creating a lively atmosphere that would have been typical of a thriving frontier business. I watched that impossible scene for several minutes, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The logical part of my mind insisted that it had to be some kind of elaborate historical reenactment. But there were too many customers, and they were far too detailed for any amateur production. They moved and spoke with the naturalness of people going about their everyday business, not like actors following a script. The shopkeeper finished attending to his customers and walked back toward where I stood near the main counter. The group of shoppers slowly dispersed, leaving the store in small groups while discussing their purchases and making plans for the rest of the day. "Thank you again for the delivery," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that felt surprisingly cold. "I will place another order in a few weeks once I see how quickly these goods sell. Business has been very good lately." I left the LMR Company store in a state of confusion and disbelief, driving back toward Anchorage while trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. The cash payment was real enough, tucked inside my jacket pocket as physical proof that the transaction had occurred. But everything else about that delivery defied any rational explanation. When I returned to the Northern Logistics office the next day, I filed my delivery report as a successful completion. I did not mention the strange circumstances surrounding the customer or the other people I encountered inside the store. I also deposited the cash payment, which the bank accepted without questions, despite the age of the bills. 2 weeks later, I received another order for delivery to LMR, placed by the same customer, and paid with another cashier's check that processed without issue. This time, I sent another driver to make the delivery, claiming that I needed to cover other routes that day. According to his report, the delivery went smoothly, although he did mention that the customer seemed unusually old-fashioned in the way he dressed and spoke. I have not returned to LMR since that October day, and I have requested that other drivers handle any future deliveries to that location. But I still think about the company store and wonder whether it continues serving customers who have been shopping there for more than a century, carrying out commercial transactions that somehow cross the gap between the world of the living and whatever exists beyond. Story 6. I specialize in photographing abandoned places along the last frontier, documenting the remnants of Alaska's boom and bust cycles before they disappear completely beneath the advance of nature. My name is Zoe Kim, and I am 29 years old. For the past 6 years, I have worked as a documentary photographer, focusing on historic sites that tell the story of human ambition and failure in one of the most unforgiving environments in the world. My work has appeared in National Geographic, Alaska Magazine, and several museum exhibitions dedicated to frontier history. Photographing abandoned places requires much more than technical skill with a camera. You have to understand the history of the sites you visit, respect the memories embedded in the ruined structures, and develop a kind of intuition for finding the shots that capture not only what still remains, but also everything that has been lost. Some photographers look for dramatic lighting or unusual angles, but I have always been drawn to the more subtle images, the ones that reveal the human stories hidden behind abandoned places. That philosophy was what brought me to Latouche Island in September 2023, a remote site in Prince William Sound that had been home to Alaska's largest copper mining operation during the early years of the 20th century. At its peak, Latouche supported nearly 1,500 residents and produced millions of pounds of high-grade copper ore, which was shipped to smelters in Tacoma, Washington. When the copper deposits ran out in the 1930s, the entire community was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind one of Alaska's most complete ghost towns. Getting to Latouche required hiring a small boat from Whittier, a 2-hour trip through waters that could often become rough until reaching the island's protected harbor. I had arranged with the captain to drop me off there in the morning and return to pick me up the following afternoon, giving me almost 36 hours to explore and photograph the abandoned settlement. It was an expensive proposition, but precisely because of its isolation, very few photographers had documented Latouche in recent years. I hoped to capture images that would complete a book project about Alaska's forgotten mining communities. The boat dropped me off at the ruins of what had once been a substantial dock, now reduced to scattered pilings and collapsed planks jutting from the water like broken teeth. The harbor was eerily silent, except for the sound of waves gently striking the rocky shore and the occasional cry of seabirds overhead. Behind the ruined dock, I could see the remains of Latouche spreading across a natural amphitheater formed by low hills rising from the shoreline. Most of the original buildings had collapsed or had been dismantled to recover materials, but enough structures still remained to provide a clear idea of what the community had been during its active years. There were the foundations of dozens of homes, the skeletal frame of what had been the company store, and most impressive of all, the enormous ruins of the copper processing mill, which had been the economic heart of the entire operation. I spent the first few hours exploring the site and planning my photographic approach. The late September light was perfect for the kind of atmospheric shots I wanted to capture, with the low sun filtering through the ruins and creating dramatic shadows across the abandoned landscape. I was especially interested in photographing the remains of the mill, which rose from the hillside like the skeleton of some enormous industrial beast. The mill had been built in stages over several decades, resulting in a complex structure of steel beams, concrete foundations, and massive machinery that had been too expensive to remove when the mine closed. Walking among those ruins was like exploring a three-dimensional puzzle, with walkways, platforms, and equipment arranged in patterns that had once made perfect sense to the engineers who designed them. I was preparing a shot of the mill's main processing floor when I first noticed something strange in my camera's viewfinder. Through the lens, I could see what appeared to be a human figure standing among the machinery, partially hidden by shadows and twisted metal. When I lowered the camera to look directly at that spot, no one was there. I assumed it must be a trick of the light or perhaps a piece of equipment that, from a certain angle, looked human in shape. But when I raised the camera again, the figure was still visible through the viewfinder, and this time I could make out more details. It seemed to be a man dressed in work clothes typical of the early 20th century. Heavy canvas pants, a wool shirt, and a leather cap with a miner's lamp attached to the front. I took several photographs of that area, thinking that even if the figure was some kind of optical illusion, it might create an interesting artistic effect in the final images. But every time I looked through the viewfinder, I could clearly see the worker, while looking at the place directly showed only empty ruins and abandoned machinery. As I continued photographing the mill complex, I began to see more figures through my camera lens. They seemed to be miners and mill workers occupied with their daily tasks, operating equipment, carrying tools, and moving through the ruins with the determined efficiency of people who knew their work well. Some were sharper than others, but all of them shared that same translucent quality that made them visible only through the camera's viewfinder. By late afternoon, I had documented at least 20 different figures working in different parts of the mill ruins. Some seemed to be alone, focused on specific tasks, while others worked in small groups that gave the impression of coordinating their activities. What impressed me most about those ghostly workers was how natural and spontaneous their movements seemed. They were not performing for my camera or trying to communicate with me. They simply continued doing the work they had done in life, with no apparent awareness that the mill had been abandoned for almost 90 years. The most captivating figure I encountered was a woman who appeared to be in her 30s. She wore a long skirt and a white blouse, suggesting that she worked in an office rather than in the processing area. Through my camera lens, I could see her moving between different sections of the mill, carrying what looked like documents and occasionally stopping to speak with other workers. She had an air of authority that suggested she may have been a supervisor or administrator. When I focused my telephoto lens on her face, she looked directly into the camera with an expression of mild curiosity, as if she could sense my presence but was not entirely sure what to make of me. Her eyes conveyed an intelligence and warmth that made her seem completely real and human, even though she was invisible to my eyes without the camera. I spent almost an hour photographing that woman as she moved through her spectral duties, documenting what appeared to be a normal workday at the Latouche mill around 1920. She seemed to be carrying out some kind of inspection or quality control process, examining machinery and taking notes in a leather-bound logbook she carried with her. At one point, she came very close to where I was standing and seemed to look directly at me through the camera lens. When she spoke, I could not hear her voice, but I could clearly read her lips as she formed the words, "Are you documenting our work?" I nodded instinctively, although I understood that she probably could not see me any more clearly than I could see her without the camera. Still, she seemed to understand my response because she smiled and gestured for me to follow her toward another area of the mill. She led me to what had been the administrative offices, a section of the mill where wooden structures had been built inside the larger steel frame. Through my camera, I could see that the area was fully furnished and operational, with desks, filing cabinets, and office equipment that would have been modern for the early 20th century. Several people worked at the desks, processing documents and handling matters related to the mill's operations. The woman who had guided me there pointed to a large chart on the wall showing production figures and shipping schedules. Through my telephoto lens, I could read the dates clearly. They all belonged to 1927, Latouche's highest production year. She seemed to want me to understand that I was witnessing the mill during its most successful period, when copper ore flowed abundantly and the community prospered. When the sun began to set, stretching long shadows across the ruins, the ghostly workers gradually became more difficult to see, even through my camera lens. The figures grew fainter and more translucent, until they were reduced to simple suggestions of movement in the growing darkness. By the time night fell completely, they had disappeared altogether, leaving me alone among the silent ruins. I spent the night camping near the harbor, and the next morning I continued photographing other areas of the abandoned settlement. But the ghostly workers had vanished with the daylight, and my camera showed only empty buildings and rusted equipment. When I returned to Anchorage and developed the digital images taken at Latouche, I expected to discover that the figures I had seen through the viewfinder would not appear in the final photographs. But to my astonishment, they were all there. Dozens of spectral workers captured in different poses and activities throughout the mill complex. The images were subtle and could easily be dismissed as photographic artifacts or processing errors. But I knew what I had witnessed. The most extraordinary photograph was the one I had taken in the administrative offices. In the final image, I could see the woman who had led me there sitting at her desk, apparently working on documents related to the mill's operations. But more importantly, I could see the production chart on the wall behind her, with all the dates and figures clearly legible. When I researched the historical records of Latouche's mining operations, I discovered that the production figures appearing in my photograph exactly matched the documented production for 1927. There was no way I could have known those specific numbers before taking the photographs, and the level of detail visible in that ghostly office was far beyond anything that could have been fabricated or imagined. I have included several of the Latouche photographs in museum exhibitions, although I never mentioned the supernatural circumstances under which they were taken. Sometimes visitors comment on the atmospheric quality of the images or ask me what digital manipulation techniques I used, not realizing that they are looking at authentic documentary photographs of people who died almost a century ago. The experience at Latouche changed the way I approach photographing abandoned places. I now understand that my camera can capture more than simple physical ruins. It can document the memories and energies that remain in places where human dreams were built and eventually abandoned. Some sites preserve the traces of those who lived and worked there, and under the right circumstances, those traces can be photographed and preserved. I have returned to Latouche twice since that first visit, but I never saw the ghostly workers through my camera lens again. Maybe they only appear to photographers who approach their old workplace with the right combination of respect and curiosity. Or perhaps that single day in September 2023 was an unrepeatable moment when the barriers between the past and present temporarily became transparent, allowing me to document a day in the life of a community that officially ceased to exist in 1930. The photographs remain as proof of what I witnessed, tangible evidence that some places are never truly abandoned while the memories of human activity continue to echo through their empty spaces. Story 7. Someone has to care for these forgotten places, to make sure history does not simply disappear beneath the wilderness without leaving behind any trace of the dreams and struggles that once filled these empty buildings. My name is Samuel Blackwood, and I am 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I have worked as a historic preservationist for the Alaska Heritage Foundation, maintaining and protecting abandoned settlements that hold significant cultural or historical value. It is lonely work, requiring me to spend weeks or even months alone in remote locations. But the isolation has never bothered me. These ghost towns have stories to tell, and I consider myself their guardian and interpreter. The town of Iditarod holds a special place in Alaska's history as the original terminal point of the famous dog sled trail that bears its name. Founded in 1910 during a gold rush that drew thousands of prospectors to the remote interior of the territory, it quickly grew into a sizable community with hotels, saloons, stores, and all the infrastructure needed to support a thriving mining district. At its peak, nearly 10,000 people called Iditarod home, making it one of the largest settlements in Alaska outside the major coastal cities. But like so many sudden boom towns, Iditarod's prosperity was based on a limited resource. When the easily accessible gold deposits ran out in the early 1920s, the population began to decline rapidly. The final blow came in 1929, when a devastating fire destroyed most of the town's commercial district. Instead of rebuilding, most residents simply abandoned their homes and businesses, leaving Iditarod to slowly deteriorate under the harsh interior climate. Today, Iditarod exists as a scattered collection of foundations, collapsed structures, and a handful of buildings that have somehow survived almost a century of abandonment. The Alaska Heritage Foundation designated it as a protected historic site in 1998, recognizing its importance within the state's mining heritage and its connection to the Iditarod dog sled race, which commemorates the original supply route to the gold fields. My assignment was to spend the winter of 2023 to 2024 in Iditarod, conducting a complete survey of the remaining structures and developing a long-term preservation plan for the buildings of greatest historical significance. It would be my first extended stay in the ghost town, although I had already visited several times during summer inspections. Winter preservation work is difficult but necessary because the extreme cold and the weight of snow reveal structural problems that are not obvious during the warmer months. I arrived in Iditarod in early November 2023 in a bush plane that landed on a frozen lake about 2 miles from the town site. My supplies included everything necessary for a 4-month solo stay: a portable generator, heating fuel, preserved food, communication equipment, and specialized tools for documenting and stabilizing historic structures. I had also brought a large amount of research material on Iditarod's history, hoping to connect my physical findings with historical records and photographs. I established my base camp in one of the few buildings that still had enough structural strength to provide adequate shelter, a 2-story structure that had originally functioned as a boarding house for miners. The building required major temporary repairs to make it habitable, including patching holes in the roof and installing a wood stove for heat, but it gave me the safe workspace I needed for such a long project. The first few weeks passed without incident as I adapted to the routine of winter preservation work. The days were short during the Alaskan winter, offering only a few useful hours of daylight for outdoor surveys, but the long nights gave me time to organize my findings and compare them with historical documents. The isolation was complete but not unpleasant. I had always found comfort in the silence of abandoned places. It was during my 3rd week in Iditarod that I began to notice signs of another human presence in the ghost town. I started finding footprints in the snow around the buildings I was inspecting. They were fresh tracks appearing during the night and following no logical pattern. The footprints seemed to have been made by boots typical of early 20th century work clothing, with distinctive heel and sole patterns that matched footwear from the town's active period. At first, I assumed the marks belonged to other researchers or perhaps local residents who had legitimate reasons to visit the historic site. But when I tried to follow the tracks, they invariably led to areas where continuing would have been impossible. The center of collapsed buildings, the edges of deep ravines, or simply dead ends where the footprints stopped abruptly, with no sign that the person had turned around or taken another route. Even more unsettling was discovering that the footprints seemed to have been made by several people moving through the ghost town at the same time. I could identify at least 6 different boot patterns, suggesting a group of people carrying out their own survey or exploration of the site. But despite setting up motion-activated cameras and keeping careful watch during the brief daylight hours, I never saw another living person in Iditarod besides myself. The footprints were accompanied by other signs of activity that could not be easily explained. I would arrive at buildings in the morning and find doors I had left firmly closed the previous afternoon standing wide open, with no evidence of forced entry or structural failure. Tools and equipment I had meticulously organized would appear rearranged in different patterns, always in ways that suggested someone had been using them for construction or repair work. But most disturbing of all were the sounds that began to be heard during the long winter nights. I heard hammering, saws cutting wood, and the creaking of beams, sounds that suggested active construction work somewhere in the town. They were too regular and deliberate to be caused by wind or settling structures, and they always seemed to come from areas where I knew no substantial building still stood. On one particularly clear December night, I decided to investigate the source of those construction sounds directly. Armed with a powerful flashlight and wearing my heaviest winter gear, I left my shelter in the old boarding house and followed the sounds toward what had once been Iditarod's main commercial district. The temperature was around 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to make any prolonged outdoor activity dangerous. But I was determined to solve the mystery of who or what was working in the ghost town after dark. The sounds led me to the foundations of what, according to historical records, had been the largest hotel in town, a 3-story structure that had burned down in the fire of 1929. Nothing remained above ground level except scattered stones and twisted metal pieces, but the construction noises were clearly coming from that place. When I approached the foundations and aimed my flashlight into the excavated area, I saw something that challenged all my ideas about the nature of historic preservation work. The hotel was being rebuilt, not by living people using modern construction techniques, but by translucent figures dressed in work clothes and using hand tools typical of early 20th century construction crews. I could see at least a dozen men working with determined efficiency to rebuild the hotel's wooden frame, raising walls and installing roof beams with the practiced coordination of experienced builders. The ghostly crew seemed solid enough to handle heavy lumber and use hand tools, but I could see through them to the frozen ground beneath their feet. They worked without speaking, communicating through gestures and expressions that suggested they had performed these same tasks countless times before. Their movements had the smooth precision of people who knew their craft thoroughly and took pride in their work. As I watched that impossible scene, one of the workers looked up from his task and made eye contact with me. He was a man in his 40s with a thick beard and a weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors in harsh conditions. When he saw me watching, he smiled and touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of acknowledgement. Then he returned to his work, as if my presence were expected and welcome. I remained at the edge of the foundations for what felt like hours, documenting that supernatural construction project with my camera and taking detailed notes on what I was witnessing. The ghostly workers continued their tasks without stopping, gradually rebuilding parts of the hotel that had been destroyed almost a century earlier. Their work followed the original architectural plans perfectly, as if they were drawing on memories of the building's construction during Iditarod's boom years. As dawn approached and the first light of the brief winter day began to illuminate the ghost town, the spectral construction crew gradually faded away, leaving no physical evidence of their nighttime labor. The hotel foundations remained as empty and ruined as they had been when I first arrived in Iditarod. But the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of what historic preservation means in a place like that. I understood that I was not alone in Iditarod, and that my role as caretaker was shared with the spirits of the people who had built that community and refused to allow it to disappear completely from the world. During the remaining months of my winter assignment, I continued witnessing ghostly crews working throughout the ghost town. Different groups seemed to be responsible for different buildings. Each team focused on rebuilding the structures they had originally raised during Iditarod's active years. They worked only at night and only during the coldest months, as if extreme conditions somehow made their manifestation in the physical world easier. I began to understand that those spirits were not haunting Iditarod in the traditional sense of being trapped or tormented by their past. Instead, they were still doing the work they had done in life, maintaining and rebuilding their community with the same dedication they had shown when they were alive. They were the original preservationists, refusing to allow their town to fade completely into oblivion. My final report for the Alaska Heritage Foundation focused on the conventional aspects of structural assessment and conservation recommendations, but I included a separate confidential appendix where I documented the supernatural construction activities I had witnessed. I recommended that Iditarod remain a protected site, not only because of its historical importance, but also as recognition that some places preserve the active presence of the people who created them. The Foundation accepted my preservation recommendations and has continued to support minimal maintenance work in Iditarod, although it has never officially commented on my supernatural observations. But I know that other caretakers who have spent extended periods at the site have reported similar experiences, and there is a tacit understanding among historic preservationists that some places need protection not only for their physical remains, but also for the memories and spirits that still inhabit them. I have returned to Iditarod several times since that winter assignment, always during the coldest months, when the ghostly construction crews are most active. They have come to accept my presence as part of their ongoing work. At times they acknowledge me with nods or gestures, but they never interfere with my preservation activities. We are partners in the same mission, making sure Iditarod and its stories survive so future generations can discover and appreciate them. The ghost town continues to deteriorate slowly under the assault of weather and time, but it will never be truly abandoned as long as its original builders continue their eternal construction project, rebuilding their community one ghostly beam at a time. Story 8. Searching for objects with a metal detector in ghost towns has always been my weekend escape. It is a way to combine my professional interest in geology with the thrill of discovering artifacts that tell the stories of Alaska's mining past. My name is Ashley Martinez, and I am 33 years old. I work as a geological survey technician for the state, and for most of the week I analyze soil samples and mineral compositions in laboratory settings. But when Saturday comes, I prepare my metal detector and head into the wilderness, exploring abandoned settlements in search of the small treasures left behind by their former inhabitants. Most of my finds are common objects: nails, coins, pieces of mining equipment, and household items that were lost or discarded during the daily life of those frontier communities. Every now and then I find something more important: a gold nugget, an old piece of jewelry, or a tool with historical value that ends up becoming part of some museum's collection. But it was the discovery of an old prospector's map that led me to the most terrifying experience of my life. I found the map in August 2023 while exploring the ruins of Chisana, a gold rush town near the Canadian border that briefly prospered between 1913 and 1915. Chisana was unusual among Alaska boomtowns because its gold deposits were discovered fairly late in the territorial period, giving rise to what some historians call the last great gold rush in North America. At its peak, Chisana supported nearly 5,000 residents, temporarily becoming one of the largest communities in Alaska. As happened with most towns born from gold, Chisana's prosperity was short-lived. The easily accessible gold ran out quickly, and by 1916 the population had dropped to fewer than 100 people. Today, Chisana exists as a collection of collapsed cabins and scattered debris in a remote valley, accessible only by bush plane or by an extremely difficult overland journey. The map was hidden inside a rusted coffee can that I found buried beneath the floorboards of what had been a miner's cabin. The can also contained some gold coins, several personal letters, and a collection of assay tools suggesting that the cabin's owner had been involved in evaluating mineral samples for other prospectors. But it was the hand-drawn map that immediately captured my attention. The map showed the Chisana area in extraordinary detail, including topographic features, creek locations, and elevation markers drawn with the precision of a professional surveyor. But most importantly, it was covered with annotations marking possible gold deposits, including several areas marked with symbols that clearly indicated significant discoveries. The map was signed and dated, Samuel Kowalski, September 1914. I had studied enough of Alaska's mining history to know that 1914 was the year of highest gold production in the Chisana district. If that map was authentic, it represented a first-hand record of discoveries made during the most intense point of the gold rush. Even if the marked locations had been worked decades ago, the map would have considerable historical value as a primary document about early 20th century prospecting techniques. But what made the map truly intriguing were the annotations written in red ink around one specific creek drainage area. Unlike the other marks, which were clearly related to gold deposits, those red notes contained warnings. Do not dig here after dark. Strange sounds from beneath the earth. And the most ominous of all, Johnson and Miller disappeared October 15th. Avoid this area. My scientific training made me skeptical of any supernatural explanation for mining accidents, but I was curious enough about the geological features of the marked area to plan a follow-up expedition. The drainage marked on the map was about 5 miles from the main Chisana town site. Reaching it required a difficult hike across uneven terrain, but the location could be rich in both historical artifacts and mineral samples. I returned to Chisana 2 weeks later, equipped with camping gear for a 3-day expedition and a metal detector suitable for a more extensive search. The weather was perfect for late August, with clear skies and temperatures pleasant enough to sleep outdoors. I planned to spend the first day hiking to the creek drainage marked on the map, establishing a base camp, and then spending 2 full days systematically checking the area for artifacts and geological samples. The hike to the drainage was more difficult than I had expected. I had to push through dense brush and cross unstable terrain that showed signs of previous mining activity. When I finally reached the area marked on Samuel Kowalski's map, I found clear evidence that it had been the site of extensive gold prospecting. Hand-dug test pits, the remains of sluice boxes, and scattered equipment that had been abandoned when the miners moved on to more promising locations. I set up my camp near a group of spruce trees that offered shelter and a good view of the creek valley. The surroundings were beautiful but eerily silent, without any of the wildlife sounds that normally fill Alaska's wilderness areas. Even during the brief twilight that passes for night in late summer Alaska, the silence was absolute and somehow oppressive. I began my metal detecting search the next morning, moving systematically along the creek bed and through the areas where the old miners had concentrated their efforts. The detector began registering signals almost immediately, and in the first few hours I recovered several coins, pieces of mining equipment, and what appeared to be personal items lost or abandoned during the original prospecting activities. But as the day went on, I began finding objects that did not fit the typical pattern of mining artifacts. There were pieces of clothing buried in the gravel, far more than would be expected from normal wear or replacement. I found several pairs of boots, all showing signs of having been removed hastily rather than abandoned in an ordinary way. Most disturbing were the personal items, pocket watches, wedding rings, and photographs that seemed to have been dropped suddenly, not deliberately discarded. It was while digging around one particularly strong signal from the metal detector that I made the discovery that changed everything. About 3 feet down, inside what had been a test pit opened by the original miners, I found human bones. My geological training included enough forensic knowledge for me to recognize that these were not ancient remains or natural deaths. The bones showed signs of trauma, and they were scattered in a pattern suggesting that the bodies had been torn apart by a tremendous force. Even more unsettling was the number of individual skeletons represented by the bone fragments I was uncovering. This was not a single mining accident, but evidence of multiple violent deaths. I should have stopped digging and contacted the authorities immediately, but my scientific curiosity overcame my better judgment. I wanted to understand what had happened in that remote creek valley for Samuel Kowalski to mark his map with warnings about disappearances and strange sounds. As I continued excavating, I found more evidence of violent deaths, torn clothing, broken tools, and personal effects scattered as if their owners had been attacked while working. The distribution pattern of the bones suggested that whatever had killed those miners had also partially consumed their remains, leaving only fragments that had been buried by decades of creek flooding and sediment buildup. The sun was beginning to set when I realized how much I had uncovered and how far I had strayed from normal archaeological protocols. I had excavated an area nearly 10 square feet and 3 feet deep, revealing what was clearly a mass grave containing the remains of at least 6 different individuals. The implications were overwhelming. This was evidence of a historical atrocity that had remained hidden in the Alaskan wilderness for more than a century. I was photographing the excavation site and preparing to cover it for the night when I heard the sound Samuel Kowalski had warned about on his map. Strange noises coming from beneath the earth. It began as a low rumble, like distant thunder, or the sound of heavy machinery operating far below the surface. But gradually that rumble transformed into something much more disturbing. The sound of digging, as if something large and powerful were tunneling beneath the creek bed. The digging sounds were accompanied by something I can only describe as breathing. Deep rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that suggested something enormous moving through underground passages. As darkness fell completely, the underground noises became louder and more active. I could hear what sounded like several creatures moving through an extensive tunnel system, occasionally breaking the surface to breathe before diving back into their subterranean domain. Whatever was down there was large enough to displace considerable amounts of earth and gravel, generating vibrations I could feel through the soles of my boots. I retreated to my camp and tried to convince myself that I was hearing natural geological phenomena, underground currents, settling permafrost, or gas escaping from decaying organic matter. But the sounds were too intentional, too clearly biological to be explained by non-living processes. Around midnight, something began to emerge from the excavation site. First, I noticed the movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes rising from the pit I had dug during the day. When I aimed my flashlight toward the area, I saw creatures that defied every principle of biology and zoology I knew. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but much larger than any person, with elongated limbs that ended in claws capable of moving tons of soil and rock. Their skin seemed adapted to life underground, pale and translucent enough that I could see the movement of internal organs beneath the surface. But the most horrifying thing was their faces, which retained enough human features to suggest that those creatures had once been people. The miners who disappeared in 1914 had not been killed by those underground inhabitants. They had transformed into them, changed by some process that preserved their essential humanity while adapting them to an existence beneath the earth. The creatures showed no immediate hostility toward me, but they were clearly reclaiming the excavation site I had disturbed. Using their enormous claws, they began refilling the pit with astonishing speed and efficiency, carefully reburying the bone fragments and artifacts I had uncovered. They worked with the coordinated purpose of those who understood the importance of keeping their secrets hidden. One of the creatures paused in its work and looked directly at me from across the camp. In its face, I could see traces of what had once been human intelligence and emotion. When it spoke, its voice was distorted by the physical changes, but it was still recognizably that of a person who had once lived and worked above the surface. "You should not have dug here," it said, repeating the warning Samuel Kowalski had written on his map. "There is gold that demands too high a price." I spent the rest of the night curled inside my tent, listening to the sounds of those creatures as they worked to erase all evidence of my excavation. By dawn, they had disappeared back into their underground kingdom, leaving the creek valley exactly as I had found it. Even my metal detector could no longer locate the artifacts I had unearthed the day before. That same morning, I hiked back to Chisana and left for Fairbanks on the first available charter flight, taking Samuel Kowalski's map with me as the only proof of what I had discovered. I have never returned to that creek drainage, and I have never reported the location of the mass grave to the authorities. Some secrets are meant to remain buried, protected by guardians who paid the ultimate price for disturbing forces that should have been left alone. The prospector's map is still in my possession, It is a reminder that the history of Alaska's gold rush contains chapters that should never have been written into official records. Somewhere in the remote valleys near Chisana, the transformed miners continue their eternal watch, making sure the price they paid for their greed remains hidden beneath the earth, where it belongs,